Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us for immigration updates. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dominique Poirier. I'm the Director of Legal Services. And we're gonna do an overview of what's happened since my last immigration update last year at this time. So really kind of April 2022 to April 2023. So let's go ahead and get started, and hopefully I am going to do this correctly. Let's see. There we go. All right. So what is happening in the immigration world? Well, as it's been for a long time, all the action is really happening along the border with border policies, regulations, litigation. And I just want to take a step back before talking about those changes to kind of give you a bigger picture about our border and how we've changed what we do with people who come through ports of entry and our border, whether it's southern border, northern border, our eastern and western borders, for instance, Ellis Island and Angel Island, both of which are closed now. But as you can see from this graph, this is Department of Homeland Security statistics from 1925 to about 2019, so it's not too old. But apart from a period of time during World War II and into the early 1950s, we didn't apprehend people who came to our borders. Whether they came through a port of entry, whether they crossed without authorization, they were admitted. Back then, immigration, legal immigration, apart from Mexicans, was almost exclusively European, therefore white. And if you presented yourself at, say Ellis Island without a visa, because there didn't really exist back then, but you were, you didn't have tuberculosis and so forth, you were not detained or held, and you were permitted to enter the United States. And there was just a short period of time when we had a Bracero program, which was effectively a migrant farm worker program back during World War II in the early 50s, when we were trying to control the entry of people trying to work without going through the Bracero program. But apart from that, we just didn't apprehend people. And as you can see, there's a line here. That's 1965. That's when we changed the law and created our current immigration framework. And that is when we opened immigration legally to non-whites. And we had a lot of non-whites starting to come to the United States. And as you can see, that's when everything changed, and we started apprehending people that presented themselves, whether it was at our southern border or elsewhere, and we started detaining people. So it really reflects a change in policy that one could argue is what is has a racist outcome and perhaps a racist intent. But that's when it all started, this whole craziness at the border. What happens at the border? Well, whether you're an adult or a family, if you present yourself either at a port of entry without a visa, or you cross the border between ports of entry, and you are encountered by Customs and Border Protection, you are, as we saw on the last slide, you are apprehended and detained. Customs and Border Protection usually transfers you to ICE custody, that's Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And if you articulate that you have a fear of return to your home country, you have what's called a credible fear interview to see if you may qualify for asylum. And then you're either put in a detention facility or you're released on parole to continue with your removal case, but while you're at liberty in the United States. That is generally the way the apprehension process works these days. There are obviously lots of exceptions, particularly for minors who are unaccompanied, but more or less that's what happens. You're apprehended regardless of whether you cross between a ports of entry or you enter at a port of entry but without a visa. You're put into removal proceedings, and then you are either held in detention or released pending the outcome of those removal proceedings. All right, that's just a broad overview. So what's been going on in the last year? Well, first of all, we did see finally an end to the so-called Migrant Protection Protocols, MPP, or Remain in Mexico policy. As some of you might know, that was implemented by the Trump administration in January of 2019 as a way to force asylum seekers out of the United States. And they were required to remain, people who were put into this program, and not everyone was put into the program, but those that were required to remain in Mexico, but somehow attend all their removal proceedings in person in the US. And if they wanted to pursue asylum, find an attorney and file the application and do all that stuff. As you can imagine, it was a complete disaster. I mean, how do you function? It's hard enough to access attorneys to file for asylum when you're in the United States, never mind if you're, living in a shelter in Mexico or something along the border. Biden terminated the program immediately upon taking office in January of 2021, but the administration was sued by Texas. And that court issued an injunction requiring the Biden administration to reinstate the program, which was then restarted in December of 2021. But last year, the Supreme Court ruled last summer that the Biden administration had terminated the program legally. They followed all the rules, they did everything they were supposed to do. And so the administration was finally able to wind down that program. I believe the last individual that was put in the MPP program was placed in the program around August of 2022. So we no longer have Remain in Mexico. We do have the residual effects in that, because there were thousands and thousands of individuals put in the program, we do sometimes still come across people who were finally admitted or have tried again to get into the country because they were excluded through MPP. So there are the residual effects, but no new people are being placed in that program. But we have other things going on at the border to keep out asylum seekers and other migrants. So what is going on? You all have, I'm sure, heard of Title 42. I've talked about it before. I talked about it last year. It's still going on, unbelievably. So what is Title 42? Title 42 is actually an older provision of the US Code that permits the government to expel migrants, including asylum seekers, based on a national emergency. And in this case, the national emergency was the COVID pandemic. So the Trump administration, perhaps after seeing the disaster of the MPP program, they declared a public health emergency, right? I mean, it was, the pandemic was clearly a public health emergency, but they used that to trigger the Title 42 provision, through which the Trump administration, led by the Biden administration, were able to keep out or expel 2 million individuals. So it was widely used, much more extensively used than migrant protection protocols. The Biden administration, upon taking office, also tried to halt, in addition to MPP, Title 42, but not surprisingly, the Biden administration was sued by a number of states this time, not just Texas. And once again, the administration was required through the litigation to continue with the program. That's where we are right now. However, the administration has decided to end the public health emergency that is underpinning the Title 42. So on May 11th, they are rescinding the pandemic-related public health emergency. And that will then cease the trigger necessary to invoke Title 42. So we believe that hopefully starting May 11th, Title 42 will no longer be eligible as a stick to expel both migrants and asylum seekers that are coming to the border. I want to say that the combination of these two policies, which started under Trump but continued under the Biden administration, created a virtual wall. I mean, it has been very difficult for especially asylum seekers to enter the US and request asylum. And this really is in violation of both our treaty obligations, but also just basic US law. This is the asylum law, all right? It can be found at section 1158 of the US Code. Any alien who is physically present in the US or who arrives in the US, whether or not at a designated port of arrival, and irrespective of such alien status, may apply for asylum. So the golden standard of asylum law has always been, it doesn't matter how you get here. If you're here and you qualify because you have a fear of return based on all the grounds you have to prove, you can apply for asylum. We don't care if you enter legally or illegally. And so implementing Title 42 and the migrant protections protocols has, in scholarly circles, has certainly violated this legal provision as well as some of our treaty obligations. All right, those are two sticks that have been used in the last several years to keep out migrants in the southern border, to apprehend them and expel them back out of the country. What's interesting in the last year is the use of the Biden administration of the parole mechanism. So instead of a stick, it's a carrot, I would say, to stop the numbers of individuals who are presenting themselves at the border. So this parole program, we've had parole for a long time. It is a mechanism whereby the government, based on our national interest, can parole in on a case-by-case basis individuals who present themselves without a visa. So for instance, the Afghans that were airlifted out of Kabul in August of 2021, all those people were given parole while they were on the plane so that they could, when they landed, be granted legal admission into the United States. We've used it for Cubans. We've used it for Vietnamese. We've used it on an ad hoc basis. I've had kids come in through parole. So it's a great tool and allows people to enter legally. And CBP was reporting, Customs and Border Protection was reporting to the Biden administration these huge numbers of individuals coming to the southern border and asking for asylum, particularly initially from Venezuela and some other countries. And so the Biden administration started this pilot program, first with Venezuelans, then Ukrainians, and then it's been expanded. How does it work? It works by you have a sponsor who lives in the United States and can begin the application process for you. And on January 6th, this parole program was expanded to include Cuban, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans. So it expanded the original Venezuelan program to include 3 other nationalities, CHMV, right? So if somebody in the United States is willing to sponsor you, they begin the application process for you. Once that is approved, the national from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, or Venezuela would receive a link, and create an account using the CBP1 app, which is a new app and a fairly new app, and we're going to talk about it more later. So obviously this requires A, having a sponsor in the United States, B, they don't have to be related to you, by the way. B, having access to the internet and a smartphone. Once you complete the CBP1 application process, then the national, who is in Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, Venezuela, would purchase plane tickets and fly into the United States with their proof of parole, and they would be entered into the United States for 2 years and be able to get a work permit. And I think, Ashley, if you want to drop in the chat the FAQs on this parole program, and also there's 2 links on how to sponsor people. One for Ukrainians and one for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans. There are about 30,000. The ceiling is 30,000 beneficiaries per month across these 4 countries that are eligible to come in under this new process. How has it been working? Actually, really, really well. Unlike the stick approach, this carrot approach has had a pronounced effect, according to CBP statistics. And there's a link, Ashley, if you also want to drop the February 2023 CBP data into the chat, but I pulled out some of it. You can see just a percent change from the year before. It's a 95% decrease in the number of Venezuelans, Cubans, and Nicaraguans who are presenting themselves at the border. Because now they have this other legal mechanism to enter the United States. And it does require you to have somebody to sponsor you. You got to have a smartphone. You got to have access to the internet. So there are a lot of negatives. But clearly it is working. And you can see the graph, the numbers have gone down. So this is a really wonderful new development for those who can access who have the appropriate person and the internet and so forth. What's shocking to me, and you can see how litigation has been involved so much in what we've been doing the last few years, but what's shocking to me is we created this parole program for Ukrainians separately called Uniting for Ukraine. And then we created the expanded program for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans. And not surprisingly, the Biden administration was sued by Texas and 19 other states to block the parole program. But they weren't sued over the Ukraine part of the program. Just the program for people who are non-European, non-white. Which, I don't know about you, but I find incredibly troubling. That A, litigation is used in this way, but B, that people are making the distinction between refugees of color and non, and predominantly white refugees. So it really, I think, speaks volumes about what the agenda is for these states that are suing and why they're suing. Okay, that's the border. As I said, most of the action is going on around the border. I mean, most of the back and forth that we hear, most of the media stories we read, it's all about the border, which is odd because, as you can see from that first slide that I showed you, we just didn't bother with the border before immigration became largely non-white. It wasn't a concern at all. What is going on apart from the border? Well, first of all, let's turn to Congress, first of all. Last year when I said I had this slide and it was totally blank because Congress hasn't done anything. And that's true as well this year, but I didn't want to be so negative. So I'm going to tell you all their missed opportunities. So for instance, at the last Congress, right, so the quote unquote lame duck Congress, had an opportunity to pass a farm worker reform program that was announced and introduced and did not pass. The last Congress also introduced an Afghan Adjustment Act. which would, I referenced the Afghans that had been evacuated out. They were granted, as I said, parole for a couple of years. That is expiring now. All of that's going to expire, their status, in August or September, depending on when they entered the United States. But it was granted for 2 years, and their 2 years is up. So they're kind of left with no choices, or no permanent choices. And so, there's been a huge push, not just among immigrant advocates, but also among our military and our veterans, for Congress to pass an Afghan Adjustment Act. We needed, it passed the House, but we needed 10 Republican senators to join the 50 Democratic senators to get this passed, and they weren't able to get to 10 Republican senators. So it failed in the last Congress as well. And additionally, for the umpteenth time, I've lost count now, but more than a dozen, a DREAM Act has been introduced. I think in the last Congress it was called the U.S. Promise Act or something like that. It wasn't called the DREAM Act specifically, but it was introduced and did not pass. So, Congress has sort of created this vacuum, which is why we have so much executive action and so much litigation around executive action. So let's turn now to updates about executive actions that have happened. So in the last year, the Biden administration has, 1, promulgated new asylum regulations, 2, promulgated new DACA regulations, 3, expanded temporary protected status for certain nationals, and 4, published guidance on protections for victims or witnesses of labor disputes. So I'll turn to each of those in turn. The first is this new asylum regulations. So folks, let me just say right off the bat, this is Trump's asylum ban just rebaked. It almost virtually mimics the changes that were attempted by the Trump administration through regulatory action in the last administration. And basically, in a nutshell, the proposed regulations would bar asylum seekers who transited through another country on their way to the U.S. unless, 1, they previously had applied for and been denied asylum in that country, or 2, managed to receive an appointment through this new CBP-1 app to present themselves at a port of entry. Now, if you think about asylum seekers, they're mostly, many of them are walking to our southern border, and they usually have to transit at least through Mexico. And so right away, if this ban goes into effect, it's going to have a very pronounced negative effect on most of the asylum seekers who are people who wish to seek asylum in the United States. I read to you the U.S. code before and the eligibility for asylum. And so as you can imagine, this new regulation is a violation of both of our treaties and our code, the U.S. law, because if you read the law, there is no qualifier in there. Anybody who presents themselves, whether they enter legally or illegally, qualifies for asylum if they meet all of the other qualifications. So manner of entry is not a deciding factor. It's not dispositive when deciding whether someone qualifies for asylum. And in fact, that's why the Trump ban failed when they tried to do the same thing, because it was a violation of the law. So that's, problem number 1. But problem number 2, this requirement that you try to get an appointment using the app, again, it requires people to have smartphones and access to the internet. Well, if you're on the run and you're being persecuted, you do not have access to the internet quite a bit of the time, if at all. And even if you did, we're finding that there are no appointments available, and there's no way for families to make appointments together. And so it's requiring, a dad to show up if he's able to get an appointment, on March 30th, and then the children 2 months later, if they're able to get an appointment. Additionally, through this app, you've got to take your picture. And what people have discovered is the facial recognition technology is terrible for people of color. It doesn't work. And so it's definitely skewed in favor of white asylum seekers. There's a tongue-in-cheek publication, How to Seek Asylum Under Biden, is not so easy, that Ashley can drop in the chat. There's also a more serious and well-written letter from Representative Castro to Secretary Mayorkas, asking about all the issues with the CBP-1 app that is supposed to be used as a alternative to transiting through a country and applying for asylum. And, just take a step back and think, you're being persecuted, say, in Honduras or Nicaragua, and you're being threatened. You're going to run. You're going to probably leave that country. And so, the requirement that you not transit through anything, and that you've got access to internet and a smartphone, is really created by people who have no concept of how persecution actually works. Maybe they've never interviewed anybody that's been persecuted. I don't know how you create this system and not take into account threats and having to flee and not taking anything with you, which is what we commonly see with asylum seekers. The other horrible thing about this asylum ban is that, unlike most federal regulations where we get at least 60 days to comment, we only were given 30 days to comment. So clearly they were trying to shove this through. Notwithstanding that, over 51,000 people put in comments, which is fabulous. That's the most I've ever seen for an immigration-related regulation. So we'll find out what's going to happen, but expect litigation if this goes through. Okay, more litigation. It's all about litigation these last few years. That's really where the action is all happening. DACA, the absolutely tortured, woeful history of DACA, which has been in litigation since it was announced in 2012. So where are we now with DACA? Well, as I referenced, the southern states, including Texas, sued immediately as soon as Obama announced that program. Federal District Court Judge Hannon in Texas ruled that the program was unlawful. And the Biden administration, when they came into office, rewrote the Obama-era regulations in response to that ruling to try to assuage Judge Hannon's concerns. So where are we now? The case is pending now before Judge Hannon, and we are expecting a final ruling on whether the new regulations adequately address his concern. We are not hopeful. We are expecting an unfavorable decision that is likely to be appealed by the losing side. So how long is this going to continue to drag out is unknown. It really would be up to Judge Hannon and subsequently the Fifth Circuit to decide, well, when somebody appeals, then you can stay the lower court decision to allow the status quo to continue during the appeals process. So it would really be up to the Fifth Circuit to decide whether they would permit the status quo, meaning DACA renewal applications, to continue. pending litigation. That has happened before, and in fact, Judge Hannon, I think, would probably, if he did terminate this program, he is aware that there's more than 600,000 people who have DACA and would probably have some sort of longer wind down mechanism. But we are still filing DACA renewals here at Just Neighbors. They are actually being processed very quickly because USCIS is fairly aware at the risk of termination for this program. And so they have put the resources into turning these renewal applications around pretty darn quickly. So that's what's going on with DACA. The Biden administration has also expanded temporary protected status for other countries. So what is temporary protected status? That is when the Department of State advises the Department of Homeland Security not to deport nationals of certain countries because of either a civil strife or a natural disaster that has occurred in that country. And so if Department of Homeland Security agrees with the request, they designate that country for temporary protected status. The designation almost always lasts 18 months. You can apply for temporary protected status. It's a lot like deferred action, actually, like the DACAs have. And you get a work permit for that 18-month period. What happens at the end? Department of State goes back, takes a look at what's going on the ground. Things are still horrible. There's still, an Ebola epidemic. There's still a civil war going on, whatever. They make a subsequent recommendation to Department of Homeland Security, and Department of Homeland Security decides whether they're going to renew temporary protected status or terminate it. So you have countries coming on and coming off of temporary protected status. For instance, we had three countries that had Ebola outbreaks several years ago. When that outbreak calmed down, those countries lost temporary protected status. And we've had countries that have had TPS for decades. Honduras and Nicaragua have had temporary protected status since Hurricane Mitch in 1998. But it is a good way to protect nationals who are already living in the United States when the disaster happens, and make sure that they don't get deported. And the three new countries that were added in the last year were Afghanistan, Cameroon, and Ethiopia. And all because of civil strife. In the case of Ethiopia, it's also a famine going on. But it does provide a temporary opportunity for these nationals to acquire legal status and stay here and work. And for Afghans, again, we really want a permanent solution for them because we did bring them here and they are all allies, so otherwise they wouldn't have gotten on the plane and gotten through the checkpoints. So, in my view, we have a real obligation, moral obligation to do something more for them than just temporary protected status, but at least they have an additional 18 months of protection on top of their parole status if they want to apply for temporary protected status. Another new policy that has been pursued by the Biden administration, and this is quite new. It was just announced, and a process for labor-based violations. And this is for non-citizens who are victims of or witnesses to labor right violations. And that could be anything from, safety violations, harassment, wage violations. It doesn't have to rise to the level of trafficking. And there are separate trafficking protections. But it could be trafficking, but it could also be things that don't arise quite to that extreme level. It does require the applicant to file a complaint with the federal, state, or local labor or employment agency. And that could be Department of Labor, it could be OSHA, it could be the National Labor Relations Board, it could be the state components of those or federal agencies. But you do have to file a complaint and make a report. You also have to obtain a statement of interest from that agency to whom the complaint was made. So you don't even qualify for applying for the immigration portion of this protection unless you've done those things, unless you've made a complaint, you know, you've suffered, you've made a complaint, and you received the statement of interest. If you've done all that, then you can apply for deferred action with USCIS, which is it's a lot like DACA, it's a lot like TPS. It's just a promise not to deport. It lasts for 2 years, and it comes from a work permit. This program is really, really new. And in fact, I'm not sure Just Neighbors has done any applications. If we have, we've just done a handful. But we're not sure whether it's renewable, to be honest, because it's so new. So we're not sure how it's going to work. But we're trying to explore partnerships with organizations that work with labor violations, both in Virginia and in Maryland, because they would be often the first to come across these victims of labor violations. So that's pretty exciting, actually. So it's not all bad news. Despite the litigation, despite the asylum ban, despite all this attention on the border, there have been some good things that have happened in the last year. I do want to take a step back and say what's going on at Just Neighbors. What are we seeing? And we are still getting a lot of phone calls for representation in removal proceedings. So that's probably our greatest area of need. You can see there on the left statistics from Syracuse University that tracks immigration court data. And you can see that the number of cases in immigration court have risen over the years. We now have over 2 million cases that are in the pipeline that have not been decided, right? They're still pending before the courts throughout the nation. You can also see that, unfortunately, virtually half of the individuals who are in removal proceedings are unrepresented. So in fiscal year 2022, it was 47%. That has grown significantly from just 4 years before, when it was only 33%. So it's gone from basically a third to a half of individuals in removal proceedings are unrepresented. And there's a Congressional Budget Office 3-pager that Ashley can drop in the chat called Right to Counsel, that actually gives you statistics on the outcomes for people in removal proceedings when they're represented and when they're not represented. And you can see, if you open up that link, there's a vast difference. For those who are unrepresented, they're overwhelmingly denied any relief. So we really have a great need to fund legal services for people in removal proceedings. We continue to see a lot of minors, unaccompanied minors, to be resettled in our geographic footprint, which covers Virginia, DC, and Maryland. And the Washington Post put out an article a couple of years ago that indicated that per capita, the DMV area is actually the highest per capita resettlement area in the nation. So just numbers wise, we're not, Texas and California have more, but if you count for population and the percentage of the population, then we are the #1 resettlement geographic area in the United States. So that also continues to be a real area of concern for us. We just, numbers wise, we probably turn away, 70–80% of the telephone calls that we get in any given month. And many of those are individuals in removal proceedings or minors in removal proceedings. And it is very hard and wearying on our volunteers, especially, who have to make those phone calls to refer them out. That's what the need is on the legal side. I do want to, because I don't want to be selfish and talk only about the lawyers. I do also want to say that we've noticed that when you expand your geographic footprint, as we have, so we used to just be Northern Virginia, now we're also rural Virginia, and then in 2020, DC and Maryland, you exponentially increase the number of grant opportunities that are available to your organization. And so on our non-legal side, we have dire need for a grant writer to help out with all these fabulous grant opportunities that are out there that we want to take advantage of, but don't have time to, because we don't have enough bodies to write the grants. So that's another big gap, if you will, in our need. And if you feel so compelled to donate during our Spring to Action campaign, which is going on today, take a photo or do whatever you need to do for that QR code. Not always sure how those things work. And I think there's a match, and I don't know if Erin or Ashley want to talk more about the match. I'll stop sharing, but maybe Ashley, you could drop that QR code in the chat if you haven't already done that.
So there is a match up to the first $20,000, and I think we're about halfway to that goal. So I think we have till midnight tonight to reach that. So for every dollar you give, it's doubled in terms of what Just Neighbors gets from that. Dominique, there were a couple questions that came up. I'll do one quick one first, and then Jill Zabel had asked, do we expect TPS designation for Sudan?
I believe Sudan is, so it would be a redesignation. And there is a push now for that to happen. I think because Sudan has had TPS, then it is quite possible that we will see a redesignation. And when I say redesignation, what that means is, because there's a date, when they declare that a country is eligible for temporary protected status, they set a date. You had to be living in the country by X date, and it's usually the date of the earthquake or the hurricane or whatever, to qualify for TPS, because they don't want people who came after. It's just a promise not to deport. So it's nationals who are already in the United States before the disaster happened. And so there's always that cutoff date. So when you redesignate a country, you basically change the date to a more recent date. And so I can definitely foresee that happening with Sudan. It's already happened for a number of other countries that have continued to have, either earthquakes or floods or civil strife or a combination or what have you. So yeah, Jill, I am hopeful.
And I don't know if Kellyanne is still on, but there was a question about immigrant families. Is Kellyanne still here? I don't see that. I don't see there. Okay. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, there's another one in there.
Oh. Where is it? I missed it.
It's again, it says, what mechanisms is Just Neighbors looking into to expand defensive asylum representation?
Thank you.
Well, grants and donations. As you all know, I think we don't charge our clients. So we're a fairly unique organization, because clients get charged $100 for the first initial consultation, but then nothing after that. And so, effectively our services are free because we also waive 50% of the time. Stephanie, you didn't hear that. We waive the consultation fee, the $100 fee. So, we have to make money somehow else because most other legal service providers get about 30% of their budget from client fees. And for us, it's close to zero. So what are we doing? We're looking at grant opportunities, and there's hopefully a big one coming out soon. But also it's just a matter of being scrappy and progressive and active and doing things like Spring to Action and trying to raise funds through other means. You don't want to be dependent on just one source of funding. If you want to be a healthy nonprofit, you got to diversify your portfolio. And so it's a matter of looking at all our other things. And so, that's the greatest need. If we get funding, obviously we're going to hire for that. So fingers crossed. Mike Hafer, I think you had a question.
Yes, I think it's related to the question you said. I may be out of date, but I thought that you guys didn't do defensive asylum and removal proceedings. Is that changed?
It has.
Okay.
So when I took over as Director of Legal Services in 2016, I started opening us up to doing all humanitarian case types, to include asylum, which sort of necessitates removal defense work. Because most of asylum seekers are in immigration court, as well as other humanitarian case types like special immigrant, juvenile status, and other things. And so we started out very, very slowly because we wanted to do it ethically. And you don't want to, mess up a client's court case because you never tried a case in immigration court before. So it did require a lot of planning and plotting, but we got it moving. And we now actually, Mike, we have a managing attorney for removal defense programs.
All right, great.
Katie Formey, she is dedicated to minors.
Yep.
So most, the initial client would be a minor in immigration court. But that obviously means that, she might represent the whole family. So adults would be included if they're a part of the family. So we decided, because the sky's the limit with removal defense.
Yeah.
You see 2 million people in the pipeline. So you gotta figure out, what your focus is going to be. And so we decided our focus was going to be Northern Virginia and minors in removal proceedings. And that's how we started out. So that's where we are now.
Okay, great.
But Katie is overwhelmed with phone calls.
Yes.
We're also doing some in Maryland. Yeah.
Have you gotten any Afghans or worried about parole? I mean, being, expiring? And what do you tell them when they?
Hundreds.
And what do you tell them?
Yeah, I tell them that if they qualify for asylum, they can apply for asylum. And they can also apply for temporary protected status, regardless of whether they want to apply for asylum or not. And Just Neighbors goes down to the Dar el-Hijra Islamic Center in Falls Church once a month. And pretty much since the evacuation, the clients that have been coming in on a monthly basis to that clinic have been almost exclusively Afghans.
Yeah.
There have been other nationalities, but we saw a huge shift after the fall of 2021 from, a wide variety of nationalities to almost exclusively Afghans. So, Mike, I can't even put a number on the number of consultations I've done for Afghans. It's, dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens. But, I talk to them about any asylum claim, and we kind of go through what the protected ground would be. And I provide them with a manual on how to apply for asylum, because there's no way we can represent dozens and dozens and dozens of asylum seekers. And then if they want to apply for TPS, we help them with that. I don't know how many Afghan TPS cases we've done, but a number of them. I typically discourage people from applying for re-parole because I think that office is pretty dysfunctional, the one that provides parole and re-parole for people who have already been paroled into the United States. So we don't do that. But yeah.
I'll let somebody else answer other questions there, but I do have
Lynn?
one, depending on time.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm wondering about the farm workers program, since Just Neighbors is serving more areas in Virginia and Maryland away from the DC metro area. Are we getting more cases relating to farm workers?
Yes.
And if you think, given the state of the economy, where the prices and the availability in the grocery stores is already limited as we get into the summer and there aren't enough people picking the crops that are ripe, whether that will trigger some political response?
One would hope, Lynn. Like I said, there was a farm worker bill introduced in the last Congress and it didn't pass. And we've been in a labor shortage for a while. So I would hope so, but that's kind of outside of my area of expertise. My husband is an economist, but not me. But to answer the first part of your question, yes, with our enlarged footprint and the focus since 2018 on the rural parts of the Commonwealth, we have seen a lot more cases coming out of farm workers. And we also partner with a Virginia-based organization that has a farm worker program, and they're very trusted on the farms. And so that's been a wonderful partnership because, we were new to a lot of these areas of Virginia. And so there was a lot of fear. And so it really, really helps partnering with an organization that's been on the ground on the farms for much, much longer to get that, that trust initially. But yeah, we've had a number of cases coming out of, the tomato picking farms, the plants, as well as other, agricultural products, so to speak.
There was a segment on Latino USA, the program on NPR, recently about the abuse of immigrants in the farm workers program, both by the recruiters and the employers and the federal agency, Department of Labor, that's supposed to be processing complaints. It was very interesting. They talked about how the program shouldn't just be extended, it should be totally reformed.
Wow, that's interesting. I'll have to watch that. Yeah. The nice thing about these new labor protections that I referenced at the end of the presentation is that you have to report, but it doesn't have to just be to DOL. You can report to other state, local, or federal agencies that are doing work in that space. So hopefully we're going to start seeing some movement in that area for victims and witnesses of labor disputes.
Any other questions?
Just a quick suggestion, if you could put the links to the resources that you had in the chat on the website, if there's a place to do that, that might be useful.
Thank you. Anything else?
Well, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
We're going to see you.
Appreciate y'all coming out, and hope we have an opportunity to do this again.
Yeah. And everybody have a lovely afternoon. Thank you so much. Good to see many of you I haven't seen in a long time.
Yeah.
Take care.